We're going to get started here. This is kind of an off-the-cuff discussion about grizzly bears and what we can do in this kind of world we're living in. Some people thinking they matter and a lot of people thinking they don't. It's kind of a good time to be talking about it given the recent decision the judge made about the delisting of the Yellowstone ecosystem bears, which Todd will speak of. And it's gonna be pretty informal. We encourage a lot of questions. This is Todd Wilkinson. He's written for just about any conservation magazine, story, issue that matters. He's done it. He founded the, all of a sudden it just slipped my mind. Mountain Journal, an online magazine that focuses exclusively on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So he's a great guy for basically any question you might have about that part, not just of the states surrounding it, but just of the world. And then of course Rick Bass, he's one of our best writers, nonfiction, fiction. He's always been a really strong advocate for wildness, public lands, specifically on the yak, but he's also done some work globally as well. So we're really fortunate that we were able to kind of pull this thing together. I'm just here to facilitate questions that you guys might have. If anybody gets a little unruly, I'm here to solve that problem too. So yeah, let's just have a real open discussion, and we're going to start with Todd, who's going to kind of use our little technology here to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about.
It's one of the few times that it's more brisk in Missoula than it is in Bozeman. So I think we all should reflect on our own biases when we think about grizzly bears and think about the environment. So reflecting on my own worldview, I am a Minnesota hillbilly. I had a trap line as a kid. I caught animals and skinned their hides off of them. I have hunted and fished my whole life. I knew Sigurd Olson's grandson. I came from the part of the world where Bob Dylan came from. I also played hockey. One of the things about hockey is, to quote Wayne Gretzky, it's not where the puck is, you have to anticipate where the puck is going to be. And so I think with grizzly bears, we have to anticipate where we're headed, not where we are now. So this is a bear named Blondie. It's a bear that lives in Jackson Hole. I'm at the southern end of grizzly bear range. Rick is at the northern end of grizzly bear range. I think we're going to try and connect the dots today of what this means and what recovery means. So historically, this is the map. Most recently, that yellow chartreuse map was the most recent grizzly bear range. There was a grizzly skull pulled out of the ground near my hometown outside of Duluth, Minnesota. And so you can see how it's receded over time. You can see how Greater Yellowstone is an island. You can see this is an exaggeration of grizzly bear range, and Rick can talk about this. We'll get back to the map. But we have grizzly bears, as you know. A judge in Missoula just recently reversed delisting, and so they're relisted again. In Yellowstone, where I live in Bozeman, we are on a biological island. So here's Yellowstone again. The lesson of Yellowstone is even in the very beginning, people knew that the boundaries weren't sufficient enough to support wildlife populations. That's why you see off to the east the site of the Shoshone National Forest today, the first national forest in the country. They initially realized that Yellowstone needed to be enlarged. And so this is the extension of that, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, 22.5 million acres. It is novel for its kind in the lower 48. It's the only place where we have all of the original large mammals. It's one of the few places in the temperate zones of the Earth that still is basically biologically intact. This is the map that has radicalized my thinking as a journalist the last 3.5 decades. This is a map showing elk migration. So in Greater Yellowstone, often we're compared to the Serengeti, and I should say that Greater Yellowstone belongs to all of you as equal as it does to me or anybody else. We have the largest known elk migrations in the lower 48. We have the largest known pronghorn antelope migrations. We have the longest known mule deer migration. This is what knits it together. We used to think of Greater Yellowstone in terms of static geological features, mountain ranges, outflows of rivers, but this carries the biomass of Greater Yellowstone on its back. So tens of thousands of elk, grizzly bears, wolves, all of the scavengers. This is this bubble of where we started with grizzly bears, 136 or fewer in around 1980. The bear was listed in 75. Over time, this bulge has kind of happened. The bulge has extended outward. What's interesting about this side is we talk about biological connectivity, we talk about isolated populations. We know that island populations of species go extinct or wink out faster than metapopulations. So, in its infinite wisdom, the state of Montana said they weren't going to have a grizzly bear season, recognizing that we want to achieve connectivity to the north. Wyoming is hostile to this. If you would go down here, they had 22 bears that could be killed, 12 within the primary recovery zone, and then another 10 outside the recovery zone. All of them could have been females. Female bears are the most valuable in a population. This kind of shows the progression. Interesting as a journalist is this question of social tolerance, of who defines social tolerance with bears. As bears have pushed further into Wyoming, public wildlife onto public lands, there are still zones of tolerance that offer cattle more primacy on public lands than grizzly bears. I think that's an open question.
Hey Todd, on that,
Yeah.
what are those red? See, there's a couple like red spots. Yeah.
I don't know.
The
Yeah.
one to the north and the one kind of the southwest. I don't know, I'm just curious. I'm wondering if those are like greater human population or
I
something.
think it's the overlap.
Okay.
But, so, one of the things we hear often is that we need to have hunting of bears to manage them. And yet, within the last year, British Columbia moved to stop a sport hunt of bears in BC. It's really big business up there. And it came in response to a public outcry that said trophy hunting of animals is not socially suitable. So in Wyoming, we have a definition of social tolerance. What's notable is that BC has about a quarter of the entire North American population. So here you have a province with a quarter of the entire population, and they've decided to cancel a trophy hunt. This is a map that a friend of mine in Cody made up, and it shows existing grizzly bear range, suitable grizzly bear habitat. So you can see when you think about connectivity and you think about this notion of a metapopulation, when we think about elk, for example, it would be unacceptable in the West to just have island clusters of elk, and indeed the elk population represents a metapopulation in the West. So if you looked at this of the connectivity, looking at Greater Yellowstone and potentially connecting up, the Selway Bitterroot is going to be the great connector. And so right now, bears coming down from the north and Greater Yellowstone bears pushing up. There's about 100 miles difference. Most of those are subadult male bears that are pushing out. Before we ever get biological connectivity with breeding, it could be a while. This is grizzly bear 399. She's had 3 sets of cubs. She's had 17 offspring. She attacked a school teacher in Wyoming a little over 10 years ago. Had the decision made to take her out. All of that bloodline would have been wiped out. but because the school teacher who was attacked accidentally bumbled upon a carcass upon which 399 and those 3 cubs were feeding, the park superintendent, in league with Chris Servine, the grizzly bear study team, or the grizzly bear manager, now retired, based in Missoula, they decided to keep her alive. And so 17 offspring, half of which have died in various kinds of run-ins with people. Grizzly bears are the second slowest to reproduce mammal in North America, second only to muskox. So, where is the puck headed? You think about that map, that elk map, Bozeman, Montana, at a 3% growth rate, will double in 24 years. You divide out 3 into 72, the rule of 72. You can do it for an investment. It shows you the number of years it takes to double. So at a 3% growth rate, Bozeman becomes Salt Lake proper sized in 24 years, and in 48 years at a 3% growth rate, we become Minneapolis proper size, 400,000 people. Problem is, Gallatin County's growing at 4%, and Bozeman proper is at 5%. Bozeman represents the bulk of the population in the Gallatin Valley. So at a 4% growth rate, it's going to take 18 years before we reach Salt Lake City proper, not the metro area, Salt Lake proper. And it would take 36 years to reach Minneapolis size. So you think about connectivity pushing to the north. This is another interesting thing. We all know what's going on with Jackson, affordable housing problems being pushed over the west side of the Tetons. Right now there is a Salt Lake proper size population that extends from Idaho Falls and Rexburg, that are big boom areas, over to Jackson and down to Star Valley. The question is, what happens in the next human generation, one generation, when that infills, and so you go from 210,000 people to 410,000 people. This is a key area of connectivity up to the Centennial Valley, west of Bozeman, that connects up ultimately to the Yak. So the question is, what does recovery mean? There's no question that going from 136 bears to 700 in the core of Greater Yellowstone, that we have a lot more bears. There may be as many as 1,000 bears ecosystem-wide, but the question is, what are the prospects? So in addition to this, we have record crowds in Yellowstone, 4.2 million visits. Yellowstone is growing at 3% annually. This past year, there were a number of days in which there were 13,000 cars in Yellowstone on a day. The carrying capacity is 9,500 cars. So at a 3% growth rate inside Yellowstone, which has the largest concentration of bears and the most people, 3% growth rate in one human generation, we go from 4.2 million visits to 8.4 million visits. So whether you think this is a bison jam, I was in numerous bear jams that were 4 times as long this summer. So whether that's a good idea, uncontrolled growth, it's, I'll let you guys decide. And then this week, a report in the Washington Post, the Trump administration sees a 7-degree rise in global temperature. That will be catastrophic for the Montana that we know and love. There will be no snowpack in the wintertime. So it's not just ecologically, it's thinking about what will our farmers do, what will the fly fishing economy do, what will municipalities do. Phoenix will be almost unlivable. Every summer the days are so hot that planes can't take off from the airport, and Lake Powell is going dry. Meanwhile, we have cities that are being inundated along the coast. We have a couple of people that I know from Florida and Bozeman already who consider themselves environmental refugees. They've sold their coastal property and they've moved to Bozeman. And this week in The Guardian, we're moving to higher ground. America's era of climate mass migration is here. So the question is, Bozeman is Montana's it town right now. Whether it's 3%, 4%, 5%, that doesn't factor in environmental refugees. We have this massive reorganizing of baby boomers. It isn't immigration from Mexico or any terrorist nations. America is shifting, and people with expendable income are moving to places like Bozeman and Greater Yellowstone. So this is Grizzly 399. The state of Wyoming has said that since '75 it's spent $40 million on grizzly bear recovery. Sounds like a lot of money, except when you spread that out across 45 years, it's not a lot of money. I would bet with anybody in this room that within the last 5 years, the allure of Grizzly 399 has produced at least $10 million, possibly $20 million. In Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, alone in Greater Yellowstone, $1 billion in annual income generated through nature tourism, and 2 of the prime attractions are grizzly bear and wolf watching. So $40 million that it's cost the state of Wyoming, and yet one bear accounts for a big part of that over time. So in terms of what the value of a bear is, this bear is worth far more alive than dead. And so again, we have this elk migration map, so it isn't only about grizzly bear recovery. We won't have bears if we don't have habitat. And given climate change that's radically reordering the ecosystem and shaping foods, and then on top of that population, we're not making any more wild country. So the real dividends are going to be found in between the public land base, if we don't lose the public lands, in these private lands along riparian areas, the river valleys, that are the most biologically rich parts of the landscape. So if we're going to maintain this, we have to, this is it. We're going to lose it. You could have a 200 unit subdivision across some of these corridors, and it would be the equivalent of a coronary event in a major artery. So you lose the ungulates, you're going to lose the predators that rely upon them. So Mountain Journal. This is the era that we're in, calling journalists the enemy of the state. This is how we approach this. We are a nonprofit set up. We use Greater Yellowstone as a window for understanding public land issues in the West. I'd love it if you guys all visited mountainjournal.org. And if you want to start, and we'll get your images up.
Next time. Yeah, we use the microphone. I apologize for speaking quietly. Whenever I talk about environmental stuff, I just get fainter and fainter and more bummed. And then I realize I can't even hear myself, and I think to ask, can the audience hear? And they can't. Please holler if you can't hear me, and I'll try and project, but I think I'm about shouted out. You know, like Todd says, what do we do right now, and what are we going to do for the future of grizzlies? It's great that we got a stay of execution with the recent relisting decision, which was a real honor to sit in on and watch the plaintiffs and the defendants and watch the judge ask questions of both sides that were always deeply science-based, and that were, in my opinion, it was the defendant's job to have had that science at the ready, and the defendants, state governments of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, NRA, Safari Club, Wyoming Stock Growers, I don't know if I'm leaving anybody at Safari Club, they didn't have science, they just had numbers. They said there are a lot of bears in Yellowstone, so we need to start shooting. And the judge just kept saying, well, what about this study? And what about this analysis? And they had no answers. It was, by the end of the trial, they were stammering, and as they should have been. It was really a great, with all of the bad news in the realm of so-called democracy right now. It was really amazing to see a judicial system work with facts and better than facts, science. What are we going to do? Yeah, we might be able to protect bears for one more year. 5 more years, 10 more years, but I love the questions that are coming up now about where are the elk going to go? Where is there going to be water? Where isn't there going to be water? As a hunter, when I'm looking for elk, I ask myself, where would you be if you were wearing a 70-pound fur coat today? And that's usually where the elk are, and it's usually where the bears are, and it's going to be. I don't know there's some scientists out there. It concerns me that a lot of our great independent grizzly scientists are old. They're going to be gone, and we've got to have new scientists figuring out where animals are going to be moving and how they're going to be able to move there when it's hotter and drier. That brings me to the yak. Those are morels. Fungus. The yak is wet. That's all you need to know about it. That and that. Thank you. You're kind of scaring me about the Bozeman projections. It's like, well, heck, come up and move up the yak. We don't have any people. We need some good voters up there. We've got plenty of room. I mean, we could take another 5 or 6, and that would turn the elections. But it's wet, and there are a lot of mosquitoes, and the people who live there are really mean. So, go to Bozeman. Yeah. Dead white bark pine. The bears up in the yak. It's in the northwest corner of Montana, right on the BC and Idaho border. They're slightly different, and sometimes maybe even more than slightly different race of bears than what we encounter in Yellowstone and Wind Rivers and Absarokas and even in Glacier. We often see bears in alpine country, grazing, eating a lot of grass, drifting from meat source to meat source, but doing a lot of grazing. The bears in yak are not meat based. It's even more vegetable based than most grizzlies, which is a lot. They're smaller, they're more secretive, they're interior forest dwellers. They don't use alpine habitat much because there is an alpine habitat in the yak, and that's going to be what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and hope to answer questions where I don't just rant about what's happening up there. I still want to tell you about the yak before I tell you about the problem. So it's wet. It's the lowest elevation in the state, 1,888 feet, where the Yak River comes into the Kootenai River. A lot of water. The Kootenai is the biggest tributary to the Columbia. It's the wettest portion of the state and lowest elevation. It looks like the Appalachians. It's really heavily metamorphosed. It's these soft, animal-shaped hills rolling to the horizon. Not that fantastic rock and ice glaciated landscape that we love about western Montana. And that is so great to recreate in. It's for this reason and many others that I think the yak will be a climate haven, a refuge for climate displacement of all species, not humans, but this 97% national forest is why I'm teasing about everybody move up there. You can't move up there. There's no room for you. It's your land, but you can't live there. I guess you could. You'd have to buy. Yeah. That's the social. Yeah. Yeah. Did I say it's wet and a lot of mosquitoes and mean? But, I don't know why that slides in there. I guess it's just the limited alpine habitat. This is Buckhorn Ridge, where a thru-hiker trail, a recreational high-volume thru-hiker trail, a 1,200-mile trail from the Continental Divide and Glacier has been authorized to go to the Pacific Ocean. And it goes right through this little 3% alpine ecosystem of northwest corner of the Northwest Valley in Northwest Yak. And that's where the bears hang out in late summer and fall when hikers are moving through there. And it's where the female grizzlies hang out. It's kind of a train wreck if putting a high number of campers in this very limited area. So a group that I'm working with, the Yak Valley Forest Council, is working to reroute this trail out of designated core grizzly habitat. This isn't just core grizzly habitat in the Yak. This is priority 1 habitat where females with cubs live. We've got 3, possibly 4 breeding females this year with cubs in the yak. I mean, at this point it switches perhaps from a scientific story of recovery and corridors and policy and politics to almost a creation story or first, you know, yeah, creation story. It almost sounds like Noah's Ark, you know, like when we get down to 2, you know, just down to 2 animals, what happens? Well, we've got 3 or 4 breeding age females with cubs. This is what it looks like in the yak. It's not really recognizable as Montana. It looks like other places. The best thing the grizzlies have going for them up here is there aren't people in these landscapes. I'm just seeing these pictures for the first time. I asked my daughter Lowry to send me some photos of yak. I don't know. There's home. Oh wow. We had on the day of leaving to come down to the trial, we saw a beautiful young grizzly in this marsh that morning. Yeah, wet. It's pretty, right? But it's dark and shady and interior. It's just not a real recreation paradise. It's a biological wilderness. Foggy, wet. This is funny. Yeah, but you see, this is a good picture showing this is, you know, that 3% habitat. Most of the forest is inland forest. That's a different race of grizzly bears that lives in it. This is the grizzly habitat that they all try and utilize, but there's just not enough of it. And to be putting a high volume trail of hikers through here is not a good thing right now. We have 20 to 25 grizzlies in the yak. I think in the Yellowstone, what's a range number there? Is it
700 in the core, maybe 1,000 ecosystem wide, but those out of the core aren't even counted. So they're considered expendable.
Right.
They don't add to the goal of recovery, so they're in kind of a never land.
Wow, what a like limbo. Wow, that's really purgatory. Wow. They're not Yellowstone bears, and yet they haven't made it to the safe haven of the next core that they're trying to get to. Yeah. Yeah, again, thank you, judicial system. You did the right thing. That's just whack. The judge was so upset. He hit his fist on the podium or whatever it's called. He says, what has led us to this place? Why are you always coming into the court piecemeal by piecemeal? Why is this solution not fixed? Why do you not have bears going from one distinct population segment to the next DPS to the next DPS? And he was instructing the defendants, draw a circle around this area. Now take your marker and draw a circle around this area, the way Todd had with his slides, and the defense had not cared to do that. And that is what's going to determine whether grizzlies survive or not. Back to the yak. So 700 bears in Yellowstone Park, 20 to 25 in the yak, which is 1 million acres of public land, national forest. All of our 20 to 25 grizzlies go back and forth into Canada. So they're not even Montana's grizzlies. I mean, they're U.S. Canadian dual citizenship bears. And as Todd pointed out, British Columbia is no longer shooting these bears, so they're safe once they go over into BC. They used not to be safe. BC used to be a black hole, a roach motel. A grizzly that left the yak and went into BC would often not would be at greater risk of not coming back. Now it's reversed. The yak is where there's the greatest human cause mortality, still in excess of what they need to recover. Todd raised a point about that I think is going to be one of the battleground discussions in the future, not just climate change and global warming, but this idea of social jeopardy that was popularized by the extractive industry back in the timber wars in the 80s and 90s. Essentially, it's a threat. You have to do the wrong thing, or people will get mad at you and do an even worse thing. And I just think that's a really dangerous flaw in logic, and particularly at this point in time politically, to essentially yield to extortion. The way the thinking went was, if you start imposing management restrictions on public lands, say reduce the size of clear cuts, or say you've got 10,000 miles of road on the Kootenai National Forest, which we do. If you close too many of those roads for wildlife habitat, it's going to make the locals pissed off, and they're going to go out and shoot a bear every time they see them. So we need to keep folks really happy and not let them get angry. And that's just no way to live. I'm guilty of overcorrecting and getting angry in the other direction. Yeah, it's a solution that has to be a discussion that has to have a solution statewide, community-wide, neighbor to neighbor. Bears will benefit from greater acceptance culturally and at the community level, and a lot of great groups are working at accomplishing that. But at the end of the day, the best protection for a bear is big wild country where there aren't roads, where if a person wants to go in and kill one, they have to go in on foot and then come out on foot. And by the, you know, what's messed up about that? Having a bunch of big wild country protected to go in and on foot. I thought that's why we're here. So I get really upset with these social jeopardy threat hanging over wilderness and wildland advocates and grizzly bear advocates.
Are you stretching? Am I stretching?
Yeah, you can have a.
Do you want to just raise my fist? And
Oh,
so what you're saying? No, I'm just saying. Now the yak cabinet area is one of the, what is there, 7 or 8 designated?
5.
5, okay. It's one of the designated recovery areas, right? And it borders the Continental Divide one. So what I'm trying to get at, to ask a question that maybe these guys can explain a little better, that sometimes I think like the ruling as it relates to Yellowstone, people who are only kind of sort of interested or interested in bears but don't really understand the politics involved in them, it's easy to look at like the relisting in Yellowstone as being some kind of blanket victory for grizzly bears in general, when the reality is there's these 5 different recovery areas, any one of which could be determined by what almost seems to be an arbitrary number as far as what the sustainable or the right number of bears is, could be delisted. So while this fight in Yellowstone is temporarily won, you could have one along the Continental Divide on the northern part of the state, that could be delisted. And that's right next to a recovery zone like where Rick is talking about, where the yak bears, you know, they might still be safe in the yak, but as soon as they go over to, say, a delisted neighbor, now all of a sudden they could be hunted and never come back, if that happens. It's like there was a meeting in Missoula last week about what the management plan would be in this Continental Divide area should they be delisted. And it's just this strange thing where, like, genetically you have these little islands like Todd was talking about, and they're all it's like these fights on all these different fronts that, you know, that have a meaningful connection that I don't really think it's talked about enough. It's almost like it's kind of under the radar. I mean, could you talk about that a little bit, Todd?
So there are five island populations of grizzlies in the lower 48, 2 of which are fairly stable. Greater Yellowstone, Northern Continental Divide around Glacier and the Bob. And then you have the Cabinet Yak, and you have the Selkirks, and you have the Northern Cascades. The latter 3 are places where they're just barely getting by. If you had a couple poachers coming through the Yak, you could wipe them out in 1 year, right?
1 day?
1 day.
No, not wipe them out, but yeah, take out all. You could, yeah, there were no females.
Sure.
So
They would go to extinction, yeah.
one of the things that's interesting as a journalist, and again, I by design invoked my bias, and my brother Rick Bass grew up hunting and fishing as well. And so we live in this binary world, as we saw with the Supreme Court debate this week, where you're either for hunting or you're against hunting. You're either for bears or you're against bears. And in fact, I think most of us live in this area in between all of these things. So we talk about delisting and we talk about the Endangered Species Act. So in terms of metrics, grizzly bears meet the recovery criteria in terms of population, size, and sightings of unduplicated sightings of females with cubs. The questions that we haven't asked, and this is where I think the Endangered Species Act could be improved upon, is we don't ask, for example, why we hunt. We don't ask what the existence value is. One of the things with the ESA revisions is that you have to gauge the economic impact of recovering a species. So had we done that, and when grizzlies were listed in '75, given that at that point prevailing resource extraction uses were on the land and we hadn't moved to a recreation and non-consumptive economy, we never would have recovered the bear. Because the economic impacts on delaying a timber sale or predation on cattle would have prevented us. We wouldn't have gotten to the point of $1 billion nature tourism economy driven in part by grizzly bears. Second thing is, we talk about, I've heard this often among my neighbors who will say, well, we recover species in order to hunt them. If that's the case, why aren't we hunting bald eagles and peregrine falcons? They would make fine trophies, and I would imagine that some people could cook them up in a pot as well. But it isn't true that we only recover species in order to hunt them. The third thing is, and I spoke with Dan Ash, who was the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service under Obama, and who was the one who ultimately signed off on delisting, and I spoke to him 2 weeks ago. He thinks it's really good to be having this debate about whether we hunt or don't hunt, and he acknowledges that most of America is opposed to hunting. When I say this, I'm not saying that I'm opposed to hunting. I'm saying I think that there are valid questions and that within the so-called hunting community, there are lots of different opinions. And so when we talk about recovery, in Greater Yellowstone, bears are worth far more alive than dead, and when you protect landscapes for grizzly bears, you get elk with them. You get mule deer with them. So hunters have these huge dividends, and so the third point I was going to make is that the argument is that hunters have paid for bear recovery. False. Hunters, through licenses, through Pittman-Robertson, which doesn't include all outdoor hunting gear, it should. It's true that money goes to support state fish and game agencies, but the bulk of the money that pays for grizzly bear recovery has gone to support the land base, the federal land base. So in Greater Yellowstone, we have 2 national parks, consolidated 7 national forests into 4 groups, and we have Fish and Wildlife Service refuges. And so all American taxpayers have paid for the management of Yellowstone and Grand Teton and the national forests. And so if you don't have habitat, you don't have bears. You don't have elk. So the majority of people in the country have actually paid for bears. Bears have not been recovered by hunters in order to hunt. That's not the deal. It's just false. So we deal a lot with mythology, and this is part of my role as journalist is to point this out. That's not, pointing out the facts isn't anti-hunting. It's not an attack on people who go out and want to harvest an elk to put in the freezer. But we need to have an adult conversation about this stuff and not these visceral reactions. So anyway, to get back to your point and to Rick's point, you know, what the judge did in looking at distinct population units is looking at connectivity that will be durable in the face of climate change and durable in the face of population growth. And I can tell you, the people from the Southwest are going to be coming to where the water is, and whether the mosquitoes are the size of ravens or not, they're going to be coming.
Yeah, they are. And we need to be ready. And hopefully we have grizzly bears to determine how we go into the woods. I mean, we are, when you talk about hunting, you can't help but talk about ethics, I think, you know, we are stewards right now of so much. You know, Montana is in many ways a garden in the West, different from other places politically. We have, you know, we have a kind of a schizophrenic representation at times, and I think that represents democracy trying to represent the many disparate views and voices here on a lot of issues. But I continue to believe there are some issues that where there is a you know, significant majority in Montana that can defend what makes this place be better than the other places, and why we're here and why other people are coming here. And I mean, as a hunter, it's excuse my language, it's a pain in the ass to be hunting big game when, you know, there are grizzlies in there. It's like they're going to hear the shot, or they're going to smell the animal, or they're going to hear the ravens coming into it, and you have to, I mean, and usually you're walking out, you know, you're hiking out, you're packing out, and you're kind of in a dream state thinking, wow, that was a really great hunt. I'm really grateful and fortunate to have meat for the next year or two, and you can kind of be not paying attention. You step on a bear, you know, it's like the bear's paying attention. The bear's trying to live and go where dead meat is and where meat is, you know, it's also, you know, a privilege to have to be alert and engaged in the woods, thinking about where a bear would be in this kind of weather, where the wind is, and a thrill to see the tracks. You know, all these cliches we use. It's humbling to be fearful. It's a good thing. I don't like it, but I'm grateful for that opportunity, and I also don't want to mess it up and, you know, be the person who gets a bear in trouble. And I worry about that a lot, because I get into their country, you know, whenever I can, which is not as often as it used to be, but I think it's one of the great values that we can protect. How do we protect it? These 5 subpopulations, I'll give you a little bit of a background on the cabinet yak. It's politics, but I mean, this is a political time, so I want to apologize for you know, getting down in the weeds here. We hear about a cabinet yak grizzly population. The Cabinet Mountains are on the south side of the Kootenai River. They're north-south rock and ice, single blade of mountains, and it's a wilderness area. It's one of the flagship wilderness areas designated in '64, one of the first 10 wilderness areas under the National Wilderness System Act. It has about 20 to 25 grizzlies in the Cabinet Mountains. Just across the river, across the Kootenai River, is the Yak Valley, which is the southern tip of the Purcell Mountains, where they come out of Canada. Purcells are the largest mountain range in Canada, so it gives us a straw into this great reservoir of big country. And that's what the yak is. It's the southernmost place in the Purcells. There are also 20 to 25 grizzlies in the yak. Why is it called Cabinet Yak population? Because they're really close to each other. There's just a river between the two. You know, in places it's bigger than the Clark Fork. It's a big river, but it's not extraordinarily deep. It's you know, maybe half mile wide, quarter mile wide at its widest. A bear can wade across it, swim across it. There are 5 instances of a grizzly going from the Cabinets into the yak, or yak into the Cabinets, across that river and across 2-lane US Highway 2, which is not, you know, yet a monster of a highway. It's not like I-90. It's not like it's like 93 is what it's like. Bears cross 93 all the time. They don't cross Highway 2 there. Why? I don't know. I don't know. What my scientific training tells me is it's because the core populations are not large enough to create the incentive or the imperative for dispersal. You've got these tiny populations in the yak and tiny populations in the Cabinets. Why would they want to leave? You know, they don't need to leave. They've got everything they need there except each other. There's not enough bears to build up. 5 times in like 50 years that they show records of crossing. So it was a political designation designed to make it look like that part of the country has more bears. There really are, unfortunately, distinct population segments. It's like saying Missoula and East Missoula is separate, and people from Missoula cannot get to East Missoula and breed. It's crazy. You know why? This hiking trail I view as a cumulative effect on top of a population that is already not recovering. I'll talk about the politics of it a little bit, and I'll try not to bring in the scars of the struggle to allow, you know, bitterness and anger to come into the voice, because that doesn't fix problems that are broken. Back to Chris's and Todd's point, Glacier National Park ecosystem, NCDE, has maybe 750 bears. Some of the federal biologists say there's 1,000 in the ecosystem. That's a big variance. We don't know. I mean, they're moving around a lot. Why are they moving around? Well, maybe because they're more, maybe because their habitat is starting to shrivel and fry and lose protein content up high. And maybe it's because it's a younger population, which is not always necessarily valuable for a species such as a grizzly. You want a certain demographic of mature, over mature, under mature animals, male, female, blah, blah, blah. We don't know all of that stuff for so many of these population segments yet. But let's just go high end. Let's say the feds and timber industries bloated figure of 1,000 grizzlies in NCDE. The NCD comes all the way toward yak, and then it stops. A political line would said, okay, this is the edge of this recovery system. 1,000 bears there. Then you go 7 miles farther west. You know, walk, ride your bike, skateboard, 7 miles. And then you're into the cabinet yak. 25 bears have one time, never a direct connection between the yak and the NCDE. 1,000 bears here straining to go meet these 20. It's never happened. Why? 7 miles. I don't know. Again, the gap, the 7 mile gap, Cucanusa Reservoir, and a non-recovery area was negotiated by a timber mill in Eureka back, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago. Our group worked long and hard with that mill, trying to help keep it alive because family owned and didn't use high volume, and they were retooling to use small diameter trees from public lands, which is what we supported, you know, under the right conditions. International softwood battles helped put it out of business. Mechanization helped put it out. Russia really helped put it out with the low cost dumping, but also Canada dumping low cost timber. Anyway, there's this magic donut, is this land where grizzlies don't exist because they're not managed to be recovered there. Just that little scar, that little narrow scar, is keeping the yak grizzlies from getting some of the replenishment and recruitment from other areas. So if they're not going to come in and get into the yak on their own, we have to grow our own. This is the point where the school kids are really good about saying, well, why can't you just bring in bears from other areas in a truck and put them into the yak? It gets back to ethics. I don't think that's the way that the woods are supposed to work. I don't think that's the way natural selection works. If you believe, as I do, that yak grizzlies are fitted to their landscape, fitted to the shady, low elevation, wet interior forest where they've learned to avoid people, hide, be very secretive, very non-aggressive. And then you bring in a bear from another ecosystem, which, again, let's just overlook the ethics of kidnapping a bear from its home and dropping it into a strange place where it's going to have an increased risk of mortality to its unfamiliarity with the place. You lose that, what we could call survival of the fittest. But if a bear is going to get into the yak, crossing that 7 mile barrier, or that quarter-mile Kootenai River barrier, or the Purcell Trench, 7 miles there on the west from the Selkirks, that's going to be a bear that possesses a skill set to survive into the future, and that's what we want. We don't want to be rolling the dice with sedated bears in the back of a truck. That's a value opinion. I know there are a lot of biologists who want to call themselves scientists and don't have the, in my view, the security, personal self-worth to consider that themselves a scientist if they look away from the map and look at ethics. I think it's bad science to be bringing in bears in trucks and putting them in an ecosystem and saying that's how you recover them. I don't like it ethically, and I don't think it holds up scientifically. So this hiking trail that our group has spent 3 years trying to effect a reroute. It comes right along the Canadian border, comes out of Glacier along the northern Yak, and then drops down into Idaho, into the Purcell Trench, then goes back up into the Selkirks. And it goes right through the heart of that Priority 1 grizzly habitat. It's a spur trail for the Pacific Crest Trail, an incredibly popular thru-hiker trail, close to 6,000 permits last year, 2 years ago. Again, back to Todd's 3, 4, 5% growth rate. The PCT is growing. It's growing 300. I don't know what its annual rate is, but it's grown 300% in the last 5 years. You know, it's just the rivets are popping out. And early in my campaigning to protect this alpine country in the Yak from an international thru-hiker trail from a targeted destination, I made a tactical mistake of putting in text my worst fears about you know, the worst case hiker. It'd be like the worst case hunter, you know, a slob hunter driving down a road in a truck shooting a bear that it couldn't even identify, just shooting it. One hunter like that could doom the Yak grizzly recovery. One hiker who leaves a dirty campsite, leaves food in camp, can doom the Yak grizzly population. One careless hiker who comes around the trail, you know, speeding on a bike or marathon running, trail running, sprinting, can put the bears in a bad situation where they will not recover. It's a train wreck for a very fragile population that we haven't recovered with our best efforts. How is putting a thru-hiker trail going to help? I can't find any way that it helps. But tactically, I wish I had taken the time to say, you know, these folks, hikers, should be our allies, and they don't know the science of what's going on here. There's a lot of science for the Yak, ironically. Dr. Chuck Jonkel from Missoula did work with his border grizzly project all along the North Fork and up in the Yak. This trail that was authorized as a rider in 2009, nobody knew about it. The Hikers Association in Washington State had been trying to put this vision, this through trail to the Pacific through for 30 plus years. And the Fish and Wildlife Service and Forest Service kept saying, no, it's not a good idea, it's not a good idea. It'd be too expensive and it'd be bad for Northwest Montana's grizzly population. And they just kept after it, and that's, you know, they finally succeeded. Well, Congress said no, but we're going to do a study. And they asked Dr. Jonkel to analyze the route that the Trail Club wanted to have. Dr. Jonkel said his study said this is the worst route you could possibly have for grizzlies. There's a better route to the south. And he turned that report into Congress, and Congress kept saying no for another 20 years. But then in 2009, the club was successful with a relationship with Norm Dixon, the House of Representatives, and Maria Cantwell, a new senator from Washington at the time, and Washington State, and they sponsored this rider at the last second on an omnibus bill, you know, must-pass piece of legislation. And all of a sudden, this thing is law. It's authorized. There's a map that says this is where it's going to go. There's been no outreach to, well, you wouldn't need to do outreach to First Nations of Canada, even though it would affect their bears and their community going right along Canada, but there was no outreach to them. There was limited outreach to tribes in the lower 48, no outreach to conservation groups in Montana. They just put a rider on and determined this huge ecosystem disruption, 1,200-mile power corridor of people hiking through core grizzly habitat. So when we found out about it, our group, we made the decision. We had two choices, or we perceived that we had two choices: try and deauthorize the trail, make it be illegal, and not have it in Montana. You know, if Washington and Idaho want to have a Pacific Northwest Trail, that's their business, even though it's public land. Let the conservation groups in those states fight their battles, and we'll defend the northwest corner of Montana. We chose not to go that way, and we chose to find a couple of alternative routes that would avoid designated core grizzly habitat in northwest Montana. and would still be scenic for the hikers. And we spent 3 years, you know, a little about our organization is like Todd's is really small, and we're really capacity limited. And this fight, because it will determine everything that our organization is about, a Yak Valley without grizzlies is not a Yak Valley, it's just another place. And when we get down to 20 or 25, our tenor has changed. You know, if we've only had 20 or 25 for 30, 40, 50 years, we're not growing them. You know, we're still in the 20s. We've always been in the 20s. It's not working. We've got to try harder. We've got to do something different. The status quo is not working. A through hiker trail is not going to help. How much is it going to hurt? Well, we commissioned another study to find out. Dr. Lance Craighead and Bozeman and Wayne McCrory up in BC did an analysis of the northern route, the existing route, the authorized route, and found the same thing. This is the worst possible place for grizzlies. A southern route would be less injurious. So that's where we are. We're doing a lot of outreach to communities in Troy and Libby, asking for their support for a legislative reroute. Because it was an act of Congress, it's going to take an act of Congress to reroute it. I mean, every time I'm on an elevator or someplace where I'm away from people, I just start, you know, having a conversation with myself and thinking, you know, did we do wrong? Should we have come out, you know, swinging with both fists and said no to a trail until the bears recover? I don't know. Well, I could still change my mind, right? But in the meantime, we've been doing this outreach to some businesses in Troy and Libby, so it's a complicated relationship. I don't want to take the businesses who've supported our idea and say, you know, we changed our mind, we don't want to hear after all, after we've gotten them enthused about it coming. But I want to make damn sure if it does come, it doesn't go through core grizzly habitat. So that's where we are, and our delegation is taking letters of input on it, and really, I thought about bringing notebook paper, like, you know, nap time for kindergartners, like we all just write a letter right here, and you know, kind of a captive audience, and it just didn't feel like very respectful to y'all, but I really desperately want a letter from y'all, and I don't want to go on Facebook and all that stuff. I mean, we did a change.org petition, we got 163,000 people signed, but I'm calling people on the phone, I'm emailing them, I'm writing them snail mail letters. We've been Facebooking for 3 years on this thing, and it's just not. It just has a blow-up social forum thing, and it gets into cattywampus this and cattywampus that. It's not the issue. I want to make the issue be, when we get down to 20 or 25 grizzlies in the Yak, that's not enough. A trail's not going to help them. And write Danes and Tester, and then you talk to people and ask them to write a letter. You know, you just go to the website. It's https://www.tester/senate.gov/contact/ yeah, you know how to find it. And Danes too. They're hearing a lot right now. It's really a timely opportunity. Yes?
On that topic, I wanted to ask you, is it the position of your group that you'd like to relocate the trail slightly, several miles out of the state? Where's the position in terms of what to do from where we are now?
Great question. The route right now is along that northern, around the BC-US border. We've proposed a couple of routes that come down the Kookanusk Reservoir, one through the Salish Range, one on the west side of the reservoir, and then through the northern tip of the Cabinets across Fisher River into the town of Libby, and then back up over the nose of the Cabinets, not into core grizzly up there. There's some burns up there where a mother with cubs is inhabiting. Then back down into Troy, then over to Boulder City and out. So
are those routes visual on your website?
Yeah, on the website they sure are. Yep, they sure are. But again, I personally think, I don't know, I wish they'd go down up the Clark Fork. That's Pacific Northwest enough for me, and I think they should go where they're wanted if they're going to go anywhere. And Yak Valley Forest Council doesn't want them in the Yak. Not everybody in Libby wants it in Libby. Not everybody in Troy wants it in Troy. No, let me put that. Not everybody in Libby is convinced it would help Libby. Not everybody in Troy is convinced it would help Troy. So if they don't want to fight for a reroute, it really help us if somebody who wanted a reroute would fight for it, because for 3 years we've been doing the trail clubs work with our little part-time workers, and it's that's taking us away from our wilderness advocacy. It's taking us away from our stewardship collaboration discussions with local mills, and we're kind of in the same situation as the 20 or 25 bears, or the 3 to 4 bears. We're our habitat is getting pinched. It's hard to be an environmentalist up there right now when all our time is spent trying to help keep the P&T alive. It's like, wait a minute, why do we always do it that way? Why can't we be meaner? And why are we so moderate and pacifist? You know, placating, peace building. Yeah, I'm running out of time. You know, 20, 30 years of being an activist, and we've got 20 to 20. These are small numbers. I'm getting angry. Sorry. Please write Senator Tester and support a reroute from the existing trail, and we'll figure it out. Yeah. Thank you.
Are those connections into existing trail systems and alternate routes, or do they have to actually be made?
Great question. The Pacific Northwest Trail Association, a nonprofit hikers club that's been partnering with the Forest Service. I'll answer this in questions and answers if it comes up. I don't need to go that far down the weeds. They ultimately connected a system of logging roads, paved highway, and trails to get through northwest Montana. Our alternatives likewise use existing logging roads and trails, less miles of road than the PNTA, the Hikers Club, is currently using. That's become a real point of contention. The club says, oh, our hikers don't want to walk on roads. Well, why are your hikers walking on roads? Because they've got to walk on roads. That's where the route goes. Ours has less roads, but that's just petty, silly politics. We need 1.2 miles of trail built between Libby and Troy. And there's a trail club in Libby that's really excited about that. Just essentially extending the old Highway 2 trail south of Kootenai River. So many weeds here, but I think I'll just answer questions if they come up. So much that's good and bad about environmentalism with this issue.
Any other questions?
I think they're scared I'll answer.
I have a question for Todd. The map showed that the grizzlies haven't pushed that far down into the Wind River Range. Did I read that right?
Yeah, so they're into the winds. Southern half of the winds gets into that zone of social tolerance, and also west of there into the Wyoming range, social tolerance. There's still sheep in there, and so it's on the southern end. You know, ostensibly one would think they could get to the high Uintas of Utah, since that was one of the last places where old Ephraim winked out there. And to the north, it's another thing, because that's about connectivity. So it's really at the southern end. You know, what I've heard, biologists that I respect, they've said this: why not let grizzlies find their way into the public land that's best suitable for them? And particularly if they're not getting into trouble, most don't get into trouble, is just let them be. But this, you know, it used to be 30 years ago, we did everything possible, invested a lot of money to keep every female alive, and now we're treating female bears as expendable. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is, you know, this is really, it is worthy of celebration. I mean, we stabilized the greater Yellowstone bear population. Other countries in the world dealing with lions and tigers and other animals are looking at us and saying, look, in the populated backyard of the American West, they can do it, they can show tolerance, we can coexist. So this is a good news story. There are no villains in this story. But when it gets to recovery of thinking about the long term, You know, most bears don't get into trouble. Most wolves don't get into trouble. And yet we extrapolate, or if someone unfortunately gets killed, I don't know of a person who didn't feel bad about that. But you know, more people were injured by elk and bison in Yellowstone than bears this summer. More people are being abused by other people in Missoula right now as we speak than bears harming people. And so, should bears be in the suburbs? No. Anybody who supposes that they should be because of the high risk, a kid gets killed and you've just set the dialogue back. But there's a lot of wild country out there, and it's really a testament to this notion. It's too bad that our good friend Doug Peacock couldn't be here, who's the major push for post-Pleistocene rewilding. There's a lot of landscapes that are being healed out there with logging roads being shut down, so there's a lot of gains that can be had. There are a lot of ranchers who are practicing better with coexistence. They're doing a great job. And the great invention of our lifetime for those of us who love wild country is pepper spray. It's a technology disruption, just as Ted Turner's CNN was to the networks, or the iPhone was to anything. You know, it's a technology disruptor to bullets, and it really works. I mean, it's a game-changing thing, and this level of I think exaggerated fear that exists out there. I do a lot of bushwhacking in the backcountry, and as Rick says, heightened awareness, but there's nothing that makes that more alive. And if you look at it, here's one more thing. One would think if bears were this menace, you have Grizzly 399 that I wrote a book about. She reset herself up along the roadside in Grand Teton because her first cub was killed by a big boar in the backcountry. And so she reset herself up because she could find natural food along the roadside of Grand Teton in the Bridger Teton forest. And so she's coming down, and there are crowds there, and as this Yale University professor said, she's making 100 different decisions as she's coming in there, and you've got people swarming. And you know what? This notoriously temperamental carnivore, omnivore, is to saying, I'm not going to go attack a person. And she's teaching that behavior to others. And so while the value of backcountry bears is really important, the value of really smart, intelligent, human tolerant, I wouldn't call them human habituated, I would call them human tolerant bears, is really important as the population swells. They don't want to have any trouble with humans. Are people going to get hurt once in a while? Yeah, they are, and that's really unfortunate. But in terms of lethality, it's been a game changer of reducing the amount of lethal care. And a lot of that was just based on, primal fear of bears. But there are bears out in a lot of places, closer than we think. They're in places where they haven't been seen in a century in Greater Yellowstone. They're in the backyard of Bozeman, Montana. And so the point was, you'd think with 4.2 million people, most of them front country visitors, but still 4.2 million visitors into Yellowstone, you'd think that there would be, if you had these notoriously temperamental bears, that it would be carnage out there, and it isn't carnage. So I think we need to rethink our relationship with these animals, because bear attacks are still incredibly rare, and exponentially more people are killed by feral and dogs that are off leash than by grizzly bears. So anyway, that's not minimizing loss. It's not.
Yeah, the bear spray. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Jonko helped create that, tested, and it is a game changer and a lifesaver for humans and bears. That a great question about the population moving southeast out of Yellowstone. Dr. David Mattson has a great presentation. If you ever get to hear it, please go do so. Showing and Jesse Logan, a friend of Doug's and Todd's and mine, world's eminent expert on whitebark pine. The extinction of whitebark pine is driving female grizzlies down into the meat diets of Yellowstone, which is bison, winter-killed bison, and that's where the big males are. And so the females are going to be at higher risk with their young to go, if they have to go fight a big male for a buffalo, they're going to lose with their cubs in tow. So, but this meat diet that's trying to replace the high nutrition of whitebark pine is drifting toward cattleland in the southeast of the ecosystem, and that's a whole other train wreck coming that, again, the feds did not analyze. They just said, look, we've got more bears, mission accomplished. And we're seeing a lot of, stallhorn warnings going off for different reasons, and you don't have to be a scientist to understand it. I mean, you say, yeah, that doesn't look right. What's all that stuff going to the south? What's that about? Well, it's the whitebark pine going extinct up high, and they still need protein. I want to say something else about the yak. Yeah, right, Senator Tester, right, Senator Daines. Anybody who talks to David Brooks with the I-186 initiative, and TU had a really great point. Go ahead and talk to the representative for Montana, and also for the candidate who is running to unseat the incumbent, because it's going to be one of the two of them. And if the incumbent is replaced, it's going to be hard to get a conversation, an audience with the new representative. So now is the time on this issue and so many others to begin developing that relationship. That's what's great about Montana. I mean, we have relationships, first name relationships with our delegation, and that's there's a lot about that's why people died. Whenever a football player kneels to protest his country's actions, it's like everybody gets bent out of shape saying that people died for that right, and people died for us to have the first name, or the right to have a first name, or the relationship to have a first name basis with some really important people right now. It wasn't that way when I lived in Texas, in Houston. That's one of the things I love and hate most about here. It's really frustrating when they don't hear you, but it's really gratifying when they do.
I just want to make a quick observation about democracy. So when grizzly bears were taken into basically federal custody, they became federal bears. That's the only time that they're taken out of states' rights. 650,000 people commented on grizzly bear recovery. We invite the public to do it. We worry about apathy out there, and so the public weighed in. 650,000 comments, millions of people if you had added up all the petitions. Of that, the vast, overwhelming majority said they didn't want the bears delisted, and they certainly didn't want them hunted. So agree or disagree with that? So they're turned over to state control, and so in Wyoming it was the governor, 1 plus 7 political appointees, who ultimately made the decision of whether to hunt. And we're in these times of changing values, reassessing economic value, though we know that existence value is priceless. And so it's almost, and I'm just saying this as a journalist, because oftentimes the stories are about mentioning a public comment period for a given issue or something. One of the things that former Senator Baucus said to me is far more effective than signing a petition is to write a hand letter. Old-fashioned, as he said, it will scare the bejesus out of the young people who open it up and read it and see this thing in cursive. But equally as important is that you demand a response. And if you don't get a response, call them out in the newspaper. Nobody likes to be called out in the newspaper. And what Baucus said is if you invest 15 minutes of your time and you call back 5 or 6 times and you're chewing on my staffer and you're insisting and you invoke, we're from Montana, we believe that you're accessible to us, you'll eventually get them. And what Baucus said is, and I'm not telling you what to say or do, but what Baucus said is that made a difference. So we're in this period of, do we really matter or not? And here we had the former U.S. ambassador to China who said that people who made 15 minutes out of their time and were tenacious on it actually affected the way he saw things. And so I agree, in a small state like Montana, it's heartening that we can see our elected officials and approach them. And that isn't a luxury that exists in a state like California. And my problem, though, is I think that a mockery has been made of public involvement. When you have the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who acknowledges that most Americans want grizzly bears protected, and I just want to add one thing. This is from Bob Kiter, a University of Utah law professor. One of the problems with delisting and the Endangered Species Act is it doesn't answer the question of whether bears should continue to be protected. It answers the question of did they meet the metrics for delisting. But in the case of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle is still protected by the Golden and Bald Eagle Protection Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And one of the things that Professor Kiter has said is that we need a Grizzly Bear Protection Act that would generate funds and make grizzly bears not perceived to be a burden for the state land management agencies. Because, you know, I'm really sympathetic, actually, to the game and fish people who are putting their kids through college and have a mortgage to pay, and license fees aren't paying the full freight for the agency, and there's not a way for non-consumptive users to weigh in. So one of the things that Kiter says is, why don't we have the equivalent of a Bald Eagle Protection Act, and so bears are protected permanently, but you answer all of the economic questions, including incentivizing ranchers and farmers who are out there having grizzlies wandering onto their private property, and you take the economic losses off the table so you engender more sympathy for bears. And I think that there are ways to just be far more creative with this.
Yes?
Thanks for kind of shifting this direction of like, what do we do now? What kind of looking at the situation with this like future where the puck's going to go. I mean, we have Cheney's introducing an act to permanently legislatively delist grizzlies. So I mean, I'm honestly having a hard time seeing like relisting as bears as being that much of a victory. Like, they're just going to get delisted legislatively, it seems. And so we're going to be in the same situation we are with wolves being delisted, except for we have an animal that doesn't reproduce nearly as fast. So I guess like moving with where the park's going next, like what is the next step? Like, what's the next strategy?
If the Canadian government can ban hunting of its grizzly bears in Montana, I think that we definitely can. I agree. There's always been decades of pressure against protecting grizzlies. I'll just see this as a victory and a celebration, and I agree it's never over, but I think we can. I think, again, the judges' scientific questions, what are these DPS? There was case law on murrelets from Coos County, Oregon, grayling DPSs, the gray wolf lower 48 DPS in Minnesota. All of this case law, and bears won. Montana's grizzly bears won in court. There's precedent. I don't think it's going to be easily overturned, and I think it gives us time, and better than as good as time, it gives us it resets the lens by which we look at our 5 distinct population segments, and they have to be rejoined. Doug Peacock has started a new group with some folks in Montana called Save the Yellowstone Grizzly, and part of that organization, and we're committed to recovering all grizzlies south of Canada, and we're not giving up on those north of Canada, but that's just where we think we can have the best impact. And again, the judges' questions put it in our court. What are we going to do as a state to establish those corridors? We talk about corridors, but we're not creating them. They're not working. How are we going to make them work? We make them work by expanding core habitat where they are, and committing to better management in those places between. And we have, I really think the judge is telling us we have to do that now, or it's just going to be war from here on out. I think it's a great opportunity. What's a grizzly bear ecosystem recovery area look like? How big is it? I think it looks like what Todd's map up there looks like. It's a big piece of country. And I'm just tired of dinking and piecemealing, 20 bears here, 5 bears there. If we're going to have grizzlies in Montana, let's just decide, are we or aren't we? And if we decide we are, then let's get after it and do it big. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been any discussion in the act about reducing the forest road density? You said there was 10,000 miles of road.
There has not. It's a great question, and it's one that we need to look at. I think it's 55, 56% right now, and it's not working. So if it's not working, then maybe the math is wrong, and maybe you need 56.5, maybe you need 57%, maybe you need 62. We need a study. We need some good scientists to come in and reassess that. We need to reassess which roads are actually closed up there. There are a lot, Kootenai has a history of phantom forest of showing standing timber inventory when it was already clear cut. And I think the same thing is probably going on with, I know it is, with a lot of roads they say are closed. They're not closed. Yeah, we need, it's, the reason the Yak and the Kootenai have gotten in trouble ecologically is because there just hasn't been a lot of people up there to see it and talk about it and enforce it. And we're juggling a lot of knives with our little group. We sure need help. Yes.
So you said that there are 20 to 25 in the cabinet and 20 to 25 in the Yak, and that hasn't changed. What are the causes of mortality up there?
Great question. Actually, the cabinets have increased somewhat from the 70s when bears were initially listed through the augmentation program, where they do go in and catch Canadian bears and then bring them in and drop them into the cabinets. A really sad and not little discussed fact is that all of the genetics, there's only one line of original place-based genetics in the Cabinet Mountains now. All of the other genetics are from Canadian bears introduced to the cabinets, and I find that chilling as a scientist. I mean, the Yak is still, the bloodline in Yak is still Yak bears. I mean, I've reported on bears in Italy and France, and where they bring in Polish bears. They've lost their initial bloodlines. They have it's like, are we talking about grizzlies? We're talking about hamsters. When you lose one, you just don't go out and buy another one or shop and get another one. It's they take tens of thousands of years to build from the soil, from the vegetation they eat, from the. I just think they're incredibly sculpted into place. The federal managers will often say, "Oh, they're so plastic. They're so adaptive. They're so diversified in their ability to survive." And really, they're not. They're really specialized. They need a big country where people won't shoot them. And that's, to answer your question, that's what's happened in the Yak. Is a lot of mistaken identity, a lot of hostile shooting, where because you've got 10,000 miles of road, it's not as hard to go shoot a grizzly as you might think. If there were, half as many roads or, a tenth as many roads, they'd have a fighting chance. 1 million acres sounds like a lot of land. It's not. The good thing that the Yak has going for it, it's around 1 million acres. And as conservation biology shows, a round landmass is going to be resistant to peripheral erosions. It can hold what it's got a lot more easily than when you've got all these gerrymandered salamander shapes. Caroline.
So thinking about the Yak as a southern extension of the Purcells in Canada, what kind of population size have scientists suggested could the Yak support?
Great question. I think it's a pretty random number, but the number that's has become etched in stone for the cabinet and Yak together is 100. Does that look like 25 in the cabinets and 75 in the Yak? Does it look like 50-50? They haven't parsed it out that way. But for those two mountain ranges south of Canada, 100, and that seems like an awfully low number. But that's what they're striving to get. And there will be a case made when if they get to 100, to delist then, and there's a lot of other factors. That'll be a good problem to worry about. You know, as I said, we're not, the needle is not budging. The needle's, you know, really budged in Glacier and Yellowstone. It's not budging in the Yak.
And isn't your point is to connect it to the NCDE?
Yeah, no, and we want recruitment from the NCDE and vice versa, and that will be another indicator to help move toward recovery. But what number is recovered? 100 is what they say, and like you say, with connection also. There is, again, political, getting down in the weeds. In Department of Interior, there are representatives, I don't mean congressional representatives, there are personnel in DOI who want to delist the yak bears, saying we've tried and it's not working. And back to your question about open road density, it's like, no, we haven't tried. Just what we're trying isn't working, but that doesn't mean we have no more options. It's a pretty scary place to defend when you hear the people who are in charge of recovering the bears talk that way. There's also talk about folding the population into one big Selkirk cabinet yak. Then you'll have more bears. You'll have 100 in the Selkirks and maybe 50 in the cabinets and yak together. Then all of a sudden you've got 150 in an ecosystem. You can just mash more ecosystems together. So it's yeah. I don't mean to whine. It's just I celebrate Yellowstone's reclamation of momentary victory, and then I just lose my shit thinking, wait, you got 700 bears, we've got 20? Like, how are we going to win? Yes, ma'am, in the back. Okay.
This may sound a little snarky, but only partially. When you're talking to somebody like Danes, it might be interesting to bring up the idea that, gee, maybe it isn't a good idea to have a connecting trail between northern Montana and British Columbia because I mean, terrorists might come in, you know, bringing God knows what and pretending to be hikers. Holy cow! I don't know, just a thought.
Thank you for your enthusiasm and yeah. Again, just forgive me. I'm becoming so profane. No shit, Sherlock. I don't mean that to you, calling you Sherlock. I just mean to yeah, like it's no shit, America, right?
I mean, as paranoid as some of those guys are, maybe that would work.
Well, no, it does stress the Border Patrol, and it is stressing the Border Patrol. There have been a lot of negative interactions between Border Patrol and through trail hikers. You know, their packs searched, and it's just not a good idea. Somebody was asking about the fires up there in the Yak. Well, they started in the through hiker trail area. It was reported that it was a lightning striking. Whether it was or wasn't doesn't matter. It's a place where there's no infrastructure, no cell service to tell the hikers, hey, we've got wildfire moving away. You've got to get out. We've done outreach to search and rescue. People who say we really don't, that's the worst possible place for us to be extracting people from. It's a really, there's just no, I keep looking over at Todd, like as a journalist, how do you, there's so many reasons this trail is a bad idea where it's located. It kind of muddies the water because you could make the case, win the case solely on border issues or you could make it solely about wildfire issues, or solely about grizzlies, or solely about indigenous tribal sites, or solely about where is water going to be in 50 years, solely about open road density, solely about grizzlies. I don't know how to focus it and simplify it, so I'm experimenting. But your point is a great one. It's a big factor. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question for either Todd or Rick. So we talk a lot about the importance of engaging our congressional representatives and our congressional delegation when it comes to thinking through grizzly bear recovery. What role is there for engaging our local government representatives? And so the example, and this could be either Lincoln County or Gallatin or Park or Madison counties. This last week I attended a conference of the Montana Association of Counties, and during this conference not once did I ever hear any recognition of either the intrinsic or economic value of wildlife. The future of Montana was framed solely in terms of what I would say, looking in your rear view mirror towards reclaiming a resource extraction past that may have never really fully existed the way they're framing it. And even when it comes to recreation, the future economic value of recreation in Montana was strictly framed in terms of unlocking gates to enhance our ability for motorized recreation. So I think I've seen instances where there is possible opportunities for dialogue between local elected officials and our congressional delegation, but from your vantage point, where does local government play in any of this?
I think it's huge. Local government, really, I've noticed on every issue I've been involved with in Montana that the delegation, the federal delegation, wants to defer to the county commissioners. There are exceptions where when the county commissioners get it wrong, the delegation will step in and say, no, you got to get it right. But I mean, a senator is supposed to be working with North and South Korea, not so much the Yak Valley. Representatives are traditionally more representative of the state, but and county commissioners are pretty much in the West, very perhaps disproportionately given the public-private land distribution, disproportionately heard. So local really matters, and businesses really matter. If any of y'all know businesses in Missoula, we've got a board member, Caroline Stevens, here, and I'm down a bunch, and it's easy to get to our webpage. We're looking for businesses to support the Yak Grizzly recovery, and they don't have to be Troy and Libby businesses. I mean, you mentioned Park County. Park County's done an incredible job of building a coalition of business people and residents who recognize what you're saying, the value of a non-extractive economy, and they're standing up for it and really making a lot of quick political gains because of the economic factor. That's not my cup of tea, but it's a really potent cup of tea. So any of y'all who work at companies that you think would want to help the Yak fight, or who own companies who would like to help the Yak fight, please don't be a stranger. It's essentially just the next ecosystem up. Yeah.
I'll echo what Rick said. I'll use the Greater Yellowstone example. So you all saw the elk map, the migration map. That knits all 20 counties in Greater Yellowstone together. It should be the place where we start a discussion. But a couple of things. So the issue between the Yak and Bozeman are profoundly different. Our issue is growth. Your issue is still shifting out of resource extraction. So one of the things, I was at a public event the other night. There is no staff ecologist on any of the counties in Greater Yellowstone. None of the counties are talking to each other today. They used to through NACO, the national organization or whatever, National Association of Counties. There's no dialogue. Until we have a dialogue, it's as if the existence values don't exist. So in Bozeman, for example, without a staff ecologist, there are all these issues that never come in. And I would assert that the elk map provides a framework for thinking about landscape and pondering that. The other thing about growth is that the most fiscally conservative approach to growth is to have growth pay for itself instead of having taxpayers subsidize the profits of others. And so you slow down growth when you have an honest assessment of who pays for it. So with regard to the county, Park County is great. It is ahead. But we need to have the reset button for the kinds of things we're talking about. And the young man who asked the question earlier, Josh, I would ask all of you, Josh, would you raise your hand? He's hiding. Josh works for a nature safari company in Jackson Hole. He can tell you how lucrative the value of non-consumptive wildlife viewing is. He stares into it every day. And so with regard to Senator Cheney, I would argue that the county stuff is really important. In fact, that's where everything boils up from. Missoula's got a great progressive, it seems to me from afar, from Bozeman, that you've got a progressive-minded commission here. But with regard to Cheney, and this is where I'm just touting the value of the media, we have let discussions go so far off the tracks where we're into a post-fact world that we need to go back and insist that people use facts. So when Liz Cheney says that the Endangered Species Act has cost jobs or is an impediment to the Wyoming economy, I would say show us evidence of that. And I think when a journalist says something, you should say, show me evidence of what you're saying, so that you're not pulling your head out of your posterior. And I think that we should say the same, demand the same thing from people in academia and from the agencies, and most importantly from our politicians. And we don't do that. And I think that just as we need to have county commissions that have ecological literacy, we need to have journalists with ecological literacy. And the real downside of what's happened to journalism is a lot of veteran journalists who have seen this, understand the institutions and the law and how things have changed over time. They're long gone. And so we have these youngsters coming up, and they're great and they're smart, but they don't have that institutional knowledge in place to be able to ask the good second, third, and fourth questions, not the great first question. And I don't think that we're holding electeds at all levels to account.
One question. Time. I was thinking about your slide that had 13,000 cars in Yellowstone, and the capacity is 9,000 cars. It said, and you guys said, and I'm just wondering. It seems like there's been a lot of grizzly bears killed by cars this year, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of efforts being made in both Glacier, Yellowstone, you know, about like having bus people up there, also maybe reducing the speed limits. I mean, are there any kind of efforts being made to do something to minimize the car impacts? Because it seems like with all this growth, I mean, I think the problem, the crux of the problem is overpopulation of human beings. I think the human being population needs to be managed better somehow. And I think that's the problem. There's too many people, and then who takes the brunt of the whole situation? The animals, you know, the habitat disappearing. So I was just wondering if people talk about limiting cars in, at the very least, like in Denali, you know, you take a bus. When you go into Denali, you stop at the edge, you take a bus in to see everything. And why can't they do that in Yellowstone and Glacier? And why can't they reduce the speeds of cars in the Flathead area where a lot of bears are being killed, or a number of bears have been killed? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. So we know that the path we're on is unsustainable. I mean, it's obvious to all of us. You can't have 6 million people in Yellowstone National Park. So immediately we often go to, well, that can't work because you'll have stadium-sized parking lots in the gateway towns, right? And nobody wants to move out of their cars. We had a discussion in Bozeman about this the other night. Yellowstone has an $800 million maintenance backlog. So by the time you fix the road network in the figure 8 pattern, you're going to be fixing it again. And Malcolm Wallop, a conservative Republican, good on some things, bad, arguably bad on other things. He had an idea in the late 80s, and most of us in this room would say Disneyland, no way. But Wallop had an idea of why not stage people in the gateway communities, you have commerce there, and have a monorail system in Yellowstone, where you separate people from their cars, you let them off, you can control access. You know, it's the quality versus quantity argument of investing. You know, if we can be thinking about a speed train from San Francisco to LA that allows people to and we'll spend billions so that the trip is a couple hours less. You'd think in our first national park, you'd think that we would be able to embrace limits, because the whole idea of Yellowstone itself was about limits in the face of manifest destiny. And it may have started as a rich destination for rich tourists and to fill up cars that would carry tourists out and haul timber back. But the concept has evolved, and so I think you're right on the, Zion has a bus system during the summer, but we really need something revolutionary. We need a game-changing thing, because this linear progression is just, it's already over capacity, and even the outgoing superintendent, Dan Wink, says as much. And we have to push people to think bigger, and we have to be, because this linear way of thinking is just really dysfunctional. What do you think?
I was thinking like a subway through Yellowstone, but then all the hot springs problematic.
Another quick question. I hear quite a bit of focus put on the Pittman-Robertson money being used towards wildlife management, and whether that is a big part of the budget in the end or not seems to be not all that important when people bring it up, because there's not this avenue for non-consumptive use to contribute to that management or to the agency. And I know a couple of years ago this was brought up in terms of wolf management, and I think it was at a Fish and Game Committee meeting, and the money would be from non-consumptive use and put towards at least non-lethal management for wolves, and it was shot down immediately. Didn't even make it to a vote or a table or anything. And I'm just curious how, because unfortunately we live in this world that is driven by money, and so where all stakeholders, or at least this spectrum of stakeholders, have more of a say or more of a voice.
So in the late 1990s, there was an act in Congress that almost passed, and it would have taxed a modest tax, small, imperceptible when you go and you buy a North Face jacket, on all outdoor gear. And it would have been like Land and Water Conservation Fund that's tiered toward lands, but it would have been tiered toward funding land management agencies. It would have answered the question for the game warden, who now believes that he or she has to fundraise off of hunting for their salary. And guess what? The outdoor gear manufacturers shot it down because they didn't want a tax. So even the most progressive companies, so-called, shot that down because they didn't want they didn't want the tax. And it seems to me to be inevitable, because most Americans, if you look at hunter numbers, they're declining rapidly. Only in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho are the numbers holding their own or rising a little bit, and that's because we still have healthy big game populations. But if we want to do that, and you're right, the pushback is that this is as much about power and politics as it is about really truly being interested in solving problems, because it's a culture issue. And so we're on borrowed time with fish and game agencies. I mean, I would love to fund them, but if you take their fear out, and if you fund agencies and you say, you know what, we're going to pay you a great salary, and you manage them. You can manage them for consumptive or non-consumptive, whatever you do it. Now we're only focused on consumptive, and non-consumptive don't have a voice, and so we desperately need a pool of funding. So everybody knows that, it's just we're not talking about it because we're in a, how dare you propose a tax? But any thoughts?
Yeah, it almost happened, and binoculars, $100 pair of binoculars. It was a great idea, and I think it will return. I wouldn't be. I mean, I can be as good a pessimist as anybody, but I just have this feeling, this intuition that this is a really great opportunity for some ideas that are going to break an ice jam. You know, we could look at the problem as being, oh, you know, we're underfunded, we're not strong, and it's an economic argument, it's not an ethical argument. But the fact that it is economic based, that shows us where their weakness is. And as Todd said, you know, the non-extractive industry is getting large enough to have muscle. We just have to make it, know how to utilize it. When Alaska was proposing to aerial hunt wolves, a threat of a tourist boycott that would have cost Alaska $1 billion. I mean, that's real money. Back them off of that. And you know, we haven't ever pushed that nuclear option in Montana, but it's we're starting to get, you know, Alaska numbers of tourists. And do they want to come to the bear killing place? Do they want to come to the place that's not, you know, is human rights violations against its indigenous people? What kind of community are we? We get to have an economic say, not just by positively, but by negatively, by boycotting and not. Yes.
That's not that argument won't work in Grand Teton and Yellowstone. Maybe it works in Montana, but people are coming to Grand Teton and Yellowstone regardless. Like the threat of boycotting the parks, we have record visitation every year. It's going to continue to increase. Like I just don't think we should even be bothering to use that argument.
Well, it's not an argument, but I do consider it still a tool. I've seen it work in Alaska, and I think, yes, people are still going to come and still purchase goods and services. But if you can give them a choice, well, do you want to go to Glacier in Montana, or do you want to go to Tetons in Wyoming? I think that, you know, Idaho and Montana and Wyoming are not one economy. They're three separate economies, and the state tourist departments are competing with each other. I mean, I think it is a very valid consideration. I hope the Montana Tourism Department is mindful of it. It's not saying we can do anything, come on, come on, come on.
You know, and to riff off of this, I think we all in this room would acknowledge that the economic argument is a trap. Because when you use the economic argument, you industrialize everything. And you know, Josh, from seeing it in Grand Teton, the industrial strength muscle of outdoor recreation. I mean, our economic argument is one that would almost be counterproductive when you're talking about the trail issue, potentially, right?
Yes and no. I mean, this is why I think we're at a gate of opportunity here. We saw the Outdoor Retailers Association threaten to leave Utah based on Utah's politics. They're having some influence. We're testing this model. It hasn't been fully vetted. It hasn't fully failed or succeeded yet. But I do think money is real in determining politicians' decisions and people's shopping. It can be. To answer your question about the trail, in the way that Patagonia is becoming so outspoken on public lands, and Nike, you know, defending Colin Kaepernick and seeing this huge increase in market and gross shares. I think it's I agree that ethics of itself. I think it's an interesting, underutilized possible tool that we can look at. Sierra Club is really interested in, much like Patagonia, in helping change the ethos of their client base, their customers. Like some groups in Montana are afraid of alienating hikers on this trail, and so not supporting our efforts to reroute the trail to another location. Some, like Sierra Club, are saying, you know, this is a really good opportunity to reach out and say, this is the ethics, this is a value-added experience for hikers. If you know that you're making the right decision that helps protect 20 bears by veering south around them, allowing them to recover, that gives you value, you know, knowing the ecosystem and knowing that you're being part of the solution. The same way backcountry hunters and anglers, you know, are adding value to the ethical, and ultimately it's becoming an economic force. I'm not going to traffic in it, but I want to believe that there will be people who will figure out how to use these possibilities, encouraged by big groups meeting, especially when little groups want.
I have a question about social tolerance. Is there some indication that it has changed in recent years or recent decades. I never saw tallies, I guess, for the public comments for the different management strategies for Wyoming in particular, and how that kind of broke down for what people supported, specifically locals.
So there was a social tolerance examination in Wisconsin that looked at, if we hunt wolves, does that build more respect for the animal? And the answer was no, it does not. Does it lead to a reduction in poaching? No, it does not. So what leads to a reduction in poaching is that the hammer of jail time and a huge fine. Social tolerance, it's that fascinating fuzzy-wuzzy thing of who gets to define what social tolerance is, because you know what? Social tolerance in Jackson Hole for grizzly bears is profoundly different than social tolerance for grizzly bears in Cody. And there is what's intriguing to me as a journalist is asking the question of who gets to set social tolerance. So the other thing relating to this is something that Dave Mattson, our friend, has waxed on, as he said, the assertion that hunting teaches bears to fear human beings. As Mattson says, that lesson doesn't last very long when you shoot a bear to teach it to fear you. And as Mattson said, you would have to have so many occasions with a female for the female to teach that to its cubs. And then the question is, with grizzly watching being such a driver in Jackson Hole, do you want bears to flee for their lives every time that they see humans? So it's, I'll throw out one stat. Lisa Robertson, who's an activist in Jackson, calculated the value of a bobcat that was photographed in Yellowstone, somewhere just south of $400,000 for one bobcat that was visible to people who paid to go do that. So the numbers of the value of non-consumptive is overwhelming. And there was a study in Yellowstone where people said they would be willing to pay upwards of $50 on top of their gate, their entrance fee, if they were guaranteed the possibility to see a grizzly bear. So anyway, sorry to be long-winded on that, but the answer is, the one data point that we have is it did not lead to greater tolerance.
I was just curious of your thoughts on the hunting side. And I've been a hunter in the past, and I know that tolerance is highly varied. I had friends that in the Wind Rivers that had no tolerance whatsoever for grizzly during elk season. And then you run into ranchers that, even though they lose stock, they're incredibly tolerant. They see it as a life that they've grown up with and they've kind of lived with it, having grizzlies present. But lately we're hearing about mortality with hunters. Particularly last week, I think we heard 2 encounters where grizzlies were killed, one a sow and cub. And it seems like that threat of hunters hunting elk in grizzly habitat is it being addressed? What could you share with us about the risks of that to the population? And where Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, at least in this state, are at on that? If you could talk to that.
I admire people who can answer a question at the beginning, a multi-part question, and start at the top and then work down. I always just remember the last part and answer it, and then have no chance of recovering what the first 2 questions were. And in that vein, I don't know what Fish and Wildlife, if Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is addressing elk, bear. I know there's encouragement to use bear spray. I was in the Absarokas this week and came across 4 hunters, and they all had bear spray. That was cool. And they all had $1,000 holstered pistols too, like you see in action movies, and that wasn't cool. And then they had, of course, rifles. So like, what are you gonna, I mean, they had everything but swords, like bayonets, like just making up your mind what to use. Just so the culture of pistols versus spray is just really vexing to me, and I think it needs to be addressed by, again, leadership of government or a marketing campaign. And I have no idea what the first two parts of the question were.
Someone asked FWP that question at that meeting I went to last week, and they punted the answer. They said they can't even make a statement on it because it would have to be a legislative issue as far as the requiring of bear spray by hunters. So they didn't even talk about it. But encouraged that it, own that it's an issue and it's something that probably needs to be done. It's just not something that they can enact as part of what their jurisdiction allows them to do. They would have to go through the legislative process.
There are a lot of, as you know, hypocrisies and inconsistencies with this issue. So you all know that there was a elk reduction, also known as an elk hunt, that was grandfathered into Grand Teton National Park. So on the adjacent National Elk Refuge, separated by a barbed wire fence, they have a problem of too many elk. And so in Grand Teton, they still have the justification to hold the hunt because there are too many. So they're feeding elk, producing too many, and they carry on this hunt. So if we're in there during the summertime and we're not making noise, we'll be scolded and ridiculed for not making our presence known and not carrying bear spray, etc. Or if we leave food out, we could be fined, and if it's most egregious, we could be kicked out of the park. But in the fall, we're skulking around chasing critters, and we're shooting an animal, and then if one leaves it out at night and then a grizzly's on it, it creates this collision course. And in some cases, states have said, well, it's too bad, that's your you've lost your animal, and so it becomes this thing. What's really fascinating to me these days is the issue of fair chase and how states define it. In Wyoming, you can still bait for black bears on the edge of grizzly terrain, and I've asked Game and Fish, so what happens if a grizzly bear gets in there? And they said, well, they're ordered to immediately shut down the feeding station. Well, if you left your camp out and a grizzly came into your camp as a hiker, you would be fined for doing that. So we're habituating animals. The other question that I haven't had answered yet is, if you're a houndsman in Wyoming, you can go and practice and not take a cougar. You can run your hounds in pursuit of cougars. So what happens if your animals get into a sow with cubs? Can you then shoot the sow in self-defense of your property? In Wisconsin right now, they have houndsmen who run out, and they've had their hounds killed by wolf packs. And there actually have been cases where people will run hounds at the ends of their lives, and they'll go out and they'll get killed by wolves, and then they'll be compensated for those animals. So there are a lot of foolish inconsistencies out there. In Wyoming, for example, I'm working on a story right now. You can, in 85% of the state, you can take your snowmobile and drive down and kill a wolf with your snowmobile. In Montana, it would be considered outrageous to do. So in terms of the hunting community, in Missoula, Montana, where you have the Boone and Crockett that set the North American model of wildlife conservation, there's a lot of gray area in terms of what constitutes ethics, and it's inconsistent across state lines. And it comes to a head with grizzly bears and a lot of things like this. They haven't sorted this kind of stuff out. So again, I think we need to have a better discussion. Both of my kids went through hunter safety and none of them hunt. I mean, I don't know why they didn't go out, why they weren't exposed to using bear spray. As Steve Prim, expert, says, nobody wants to go out with their real bear spray and empty the can because it's pricey. But we need to have practice cans out to do it, because we could all have cans in here and pretend that a grizzly's coming in. I guarantee every one of us would fumble with that, and it's a game-changing thing. It can save our lives, but we have it in our pack, or we have it with it. You can't pull it out in 10 seconds and get it out, and so we need to take the discussion even further.
These are such great questions. Thank y'all. I know it's been a long day. Just anybody so thrilled for y'all being here. Yeah, the meat and grizzlies, that's not the dominant part of their diet, but going into the autumn, it's what saves them. Again, David Madsen had maybe you saw his presentation a while back here in town. This was at the trial, the delisting trial that Judge Christensen ruled on. The feds are saying the grizzlies, the Yellowstone grizzlies, are going to have more bison to eat because there are more bison in the park. And so therefore grizzlies are safe to be delisted, never mind about white bark. Well, the plaintiffs showed a slide at the end of the case. It was like as riveting as To Kill a Mockingbird. It was like this incredible slide. Their rebuttal, they showed a slide that, yes, Judge, it's true that there are more bison in Yellowstone. There's also true that there's less dead bison on the ground in Yellowstone for the bears, less than even before. So it's not a plus, it's a deep minus. And it's like, who done it? How can you have more bison being born into the system, but less bison dying? What's happening? Are they living to be older? Are they, no, hunters, people go and shoot bison and then carry them out in a truck. So the meat's not available to the bears. Yeah, there are more bison, but there's less meat available. It's, in the yak, we're seeing grizzlies modify their behavior to delay going into hibernation until the end of hunting season, so they can go up and down the roads and eat the gut piles of whitetail. And I mean, we know individual bears who run individual routes. We know what on the 1st of December where they're going to be, and they're going to go past so-and-so's house and so-and-so's house. But that's because we have this tiny population where we know their names and where they live. Bozeman, 300 people in the current hunter safety class required for young folks to get a license. Good news, bad news. The bad news is, where's the intimacy of learning to hunt from mentorship or small family or community? 300 in a class, and they go out and they break the shooting portion of it into 2 groups of 150. Like, that sounds like reserve officer training to me, not hunting. And like, it's easy to grouse. It's hard to come up with a solution. Like, it's muddy. I was looking at the book. The grizzly is identified as a game animal in the hunter safety catalog. This being handed out by the state of Montana. Some other nitpicking things. There's a picture of a hunter with 4 dead Canada geese at his feet. We shoot 2, and I dreamed about somebody having 2 dead Canada goose last night. There was another nitpicky thing. Oh, the NRA helps publish the book that's being handed out. And the NRA has 10 ethical hunter commandments in there, and they left off number 11. Thou shalt defend your armor-piercing, cop-killing bullets with your life. And it's like, wow. What is our Montana going to look like? We need to decide now. Before it's too late.
One more question on, so you're talking this back to the question about growth, particularly in the Bozeman area and subdivisions. And I noticed that Fish, Wildlife and Parks has a subdivision, I don't know if you call it a policy for wildlife. It was done in 2015, and I looked through it just briefly, and it doesn't seem to speak to grizzly or travel corridors. But it seems like with that kind of growth, I know there's a political side to this, but it seems like the state or activist groups might be working toward, in the face of that kind of growth, working toward a subdivision planning process that would build migration corridors along the lines of the tool you had put out, the elk migration, to try to recognize some travel corridors within these subdivisions and hold the cost, the cost will be borne by the developers. If that.
Completely agreed. So south of Gallatin, part of the Gallatin Valley, out along the highlights, there used to be an elk herd of a couple hundred that would come out onto winter range there in the winter. Not there anymore. They think that some of them have ended up in the Madison Valley or gone east or over on Turner's Flying D, and then they end up north of there. But yeah, those are really advisories. And so 56 counties in Montana, 5 are the big growth drivers today. You know, in the state legislature with senators, we still have a rural-minded state legislature, and most of those counties would welcome growth because they're heartsick overseeing their kids leave. I mean, I feel the pain of them. Their communities are drying up, and they're saying, how could Bozeman grouse about growth-related problems? And so the last thing the legislature is going to do is pass allow counties to pass statewide, comprehensive zoning that will guarantee that, because these ranchers who are on desperate times in these rural counties want to be able to subdivide, and the counties want people coming in. So we're really in a bind of, Mark Haggerty of Headwaters Economics said, the American West, 90% of people in the American West live in cities or to the exurbs. 10% of people are truly rural. And yet, if you look at a state like Montana, the politics are still rural. In Wyoming, they're still rural. And so we have this mindset that's going on, and so it handicaps the ability of the high growth areas with high ecological variables and values at stake. We're hamstrung. In Bozeman, like Missoula, we can't tax visitors. And so we have a huge free rider problem. We don't have the funds. Growth is not paying for itself, and if we were able to tax visitors, you could not only give property tax relief, but you'd have money available to incentivize exactly what you're talking about.
Maybe I'm thinking of another journalist. Did you write an article a while back about CWD?
I did.
And the Yellowstone?
Yeah.
Do you have additional thoughts as to what effect that can have?
Well, so it's interesting. Wyoming is coming under a lot of pressure, and they're now going out, Game and Fish, they're now going out sensitizing the state. And there was a court case that just may result in one of those 22 feed grounds being shut down. Wyoming, for everybody here, they artificially feed elk, and when you artificially feed elk, you create reservoirs for disease. And those animals that are in Jackson Hole mix with other animals in Yellowstone, and they disperse. So there are things underway which leads one to ask, what does Game and Fish know? Because once CWD gets into those, we don't know if they're there yet. One would assume that they're there. They're right on the edge of Yellowstone, CWD infected animals, and what's going to happen. But, that is there was a Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership had a conference in Bozeman, and a bunch of hunting groups said this is one of the most serious threats to the health of big game herds in the lower 48. And so this is going to be one of the issues of our time. It'll be interesting to see when the shoe finally drops and that CWD animals, and as you know, when an animal dies, it sheds its prions into the soil, and the soil remains contaminated for, can be decades. So you can have reinfection from contaminated soil. So when we get to this point of where you have toxic prions in the soil, it is going to be a radically different conversation that we have.
Well, if nobody else has any questions, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for sticking it out.